This morning is Palm Sunday, and just a quick background about Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, just to kind of put you in the right mindset for the Israelites, for the Jewish people in Jesus' day, the worship of coming to the synagogue was not today, it was a Saturday kind of, but it was actually kind of different even then because the Jewish day, according to rabbinical text, was not some set hour, but sunset to sunset. Sunset to sunset. So literally, Monday, if we were thinking about Monday, around 6:30 or 7 when the sun sets, that's Monday. So I don't know if you had a night job, I guess you would go to work on Monday after 6 or 7. It's actually interesting. There was a company in New York that I used to buy a lot of stuff for when I lived in Philadelphia. And it was this Jewish electronics company in New York, one huge company there. And right now, all of a sudden, the name escapes me. But they had catalogs back then, and now they're online presence. But their online store is closed until today at sunset, because that's their Sabbath until sunset. And then from like 6 or 6:30 or whatever the time was, that you go crazy and go shopping online. So it was just really weird, and that's how I figured out that they were Jewish owners, and it's a privately held corporation because of that. And so when we're talking about Palm Sunday, it wasn't the Sabbath, and it wasn't the day when they gathered at the synagogues. The Sabbath had already passed, and it was the next day, and this is when Jesus, either Sunday or Monday, we're not exactly sure, would come into the city. And so as Jesus is coming into the city, all the crowds were gathered for the Passover feast. If you guys remember the Passover feast back in the Old Testament, the Israelites were slaves in the nation of Israel, in the nation of Egypt. Originally they came in because Joseph brought all his family in during a time of famine, and so they all gathered. And that small tribe of maybe less than 100 people, eventually after 400 years of living in Egypt, became millions upon millions of people. They became a nation. According to the promise given to Abraham, I'm going to make you a multitude. And so Passover is when the Egyptian Pharaoh would not allow the Israelites to go out because he knew the wealth of the nation would go out when they lost all their slaves. And eventually, after all the plagues, the final plague was the firstborn would be killed by the angel of death passing through, unless there was the blood of a lamb over the doorpost. So every house that had that blood of the lamb on the doorpost, the angel of death passed by, but all the Egyptian firstborns died. All the animals, their firstborn died. Nobody was spared. And so it's called Passover because the Jews would gather in their families, take the lamb, sacrifice it, pour out the blood, put it on the doorpost. They would eat the whole lamb, and whatever they couldn't eat, they would burn it in the fire, and they would eat bitter herbs, and they would have unleavened bread because God says, I'm delivering you tonight, so eat bread that doesn't need to be leavened. And I didn't know this until I started cooking, but the reason why you eat unleavened bread when you're about to travel, number one, is because it spoils more easily, but number two, because for the yeast to go through and work through the bread, it takes hours. So if you leave the yeast out, then you can bake it right away and eat it. Okay? So I don't know if you guys do baking on bread or whatnot, but to use yeast in any kind of flour or whatever mixture, and to make that softer bread, not the rock hard bread, it takes hours and time for that to be kept covered and left aside for that yeast to work through the bread and for it to rise. And so God commands them, make unleavened bread, have bitter herbs. Why bitter herbs? Because the slavery that you're in is reminiscent of that bitterness. And so you're going to remember this. And every year thereafter, you're going to have this Passover feast when you were delivered out. When the firstborn was killed, except yours was killed. When the bitterness of slavery was taken away. When you got ready to move out suddenly and quickly, and so you ate unleavened bread. So these are all kinds of symbols of that. And so there's this great feast coming up in this week, and this is when Jesus gets ready to come in on Palm Sunday. And as you know, the praise team, we sang with the praise team Hosanna, which means the Savior's come. God's come to deliver us. And so they were anticipating, all these people gathered together, all these Jews from different places gathered together, some who had seen Jesus firsthand and heard about the miracles, seen the miracles firsthand, and all those gathered for this feast, this celebration, were looking with anticipation upon someone that's going to deliver them out of the Roman Empire, just as Moses had delivered the Jews out of the Egyptian Empire. So this is History 101, Christianity, basic thing that we need to know. So they laid down these palm branches, which was work, so it was not the Sabbath, and Jesus rode on a donkey into Jerusalem, and all the people said, that's it, that's it. And they started putting these branches down and saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, to the approach of Jesus Christ. Now, this morning, I don't want to talk about Palm Sunday. If you actually will go on your Facebook or our Facebook page, I'm going to put, beginning tomorrow, every day, a little reading to just kind of progress us through the week through Friday. And so I'll do that. We did devotionals before, but I don't think you guys actually use them. So maybe this might work a little bit better. But before Jesus went in, there's a passage in Matthew where Jesus does this. He asks the question. You know what that is? The defining moment question. It happens in almost every relationship before people decide to break up or go forward in their relationship. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's the question. Who am I to you? What am I to you? You guys know the question? Have some of you asked it? I don't know. Some of the single guys and ladies, I don't know if you have it. But the question is, are we going to move forward and are we going to commit to each other for our lives? And Jesus asked the question to his disciples. There's a defining moment, and it comes out in Matthew 16, verse 13 through 16. And this is before Palm Sunday. This is before all the events of Easter, but Jesus knows that some incredible persecution, some really difficult things are going to come, and they need to think through this and process through this and make a decision before that time comes. See, we know the outcome. We know that Jesus rises up from the dead, but if we didn't know that, and all the events that happen, all the things that happen, and the death of Jesus on the cross, that would be the most incredibly difficult thing to overcome in a relationship with Jesus. And so Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, he says this. It says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And then he said to them, he asked them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.'" And we know from later on in Matthew and the other Gospels that after Peter says that, Jesus looks at him and says, "You didn't come up with that in your own thinking. That was God revealing that to you. You had an insight from God. God blessed you with that understanding." So Peter says the right words, but a little later on we find out in the week what happens. Before the dawn, before the sun rises, Peter denies Jesus. He says, "I don't know him. I don't know him." You know what's really interesting? I mean, I've counseled a number of couples when they're in their engagement phase or their pre-engagement phase. And it's interesting because not always, but almost always, there's the question, and then there's the doubt and the breakup sometimes, and then the reunion. A lot of marriages go through that. A lot of people go through that before they actually get engaged. They go like, "I'm not ready to make that commitment," and they go in and they realize, wait a minute, this is really what I want. After that initial fear or whatnot. And sometimes they break up, and some of the more dysfunctional couples break up every month, it seems like, for a while. And Jesus is asking this phenomenally fundamental question about relationship. He says, unless you know who I am, then you cannot have a relationship with me. You cannot persevere through the difficult times in relationship with me. you will fall down and you will fall away from me unless you know who I am. And so he first starts out by saying, who does the world say? Who do they say? Who do other people say that I am? Just sticking with the marriage analogy, there was one time, at some point in your life, I'm going to address the married folks and the singles so people can kind of see this, but when the husband and the wife were strangers. Do you kind of get what I'm saying? There's a time when I and my wife were strangers. I didn't know she even existed. Right? And for most of you single guys and ladies, you don't know who that person is. They're somewhere in this world, hopefully, most likely. But you don't know who they are. They're other. But does that mean that person changes when they get to know you? No. I mean, there is some change and growth in us, but what happens is that as you get to know that person, they go from being a stranger to maybe a friend, to someone, a boyfriend, girlfriend, to someone that's your best friend, to your fiance, to your husband, your wife, and then, God willing, the mother, the father of your children, etc. Grandparents, none of us got to that stage yet. But the thing is that that person is the same person in the sense that they're that person who they were, even before they knew you. And the whole process of this, of falling in love or having a relationship, a man and a woman, is that you begin to see them and know them more and more deeply. At least that's the ideal. And as you get to know them more and more for who they are, the fullness of who they are, you fall more deeply in love with them. You don't meet someone for the first time on a first date or just, I don't know, in a class or someone from the, you go, wow, I'm in love with this person completely and wholly. So there's a process in which the disciples are getting to know who Jesus is more and more fully, and there's a process in which we need to get to know Jesus more and more and more. There will never come a day when we know Jesus fully, and that's the beauty of relationship, and that's the beauty of a marriage. That's the beauty, and that's the reflection of our relationship with Christ in a worldly form in terms of marriage. And I'm going to spend all my life getting to know my daughters. I'm going to spend all my life getting to know the people that are in my life, my church members, other folks, and you guys. Doesn't mean we're going to spend all the same volume of time with one another as we will with our families, with our husbands, with our wives, or even with Jesus Christ, but it continues on. And so what Jesus is getting at here, and the question that he's asking is very telling. He's saying, what do people who don't know me very well say about me? You see, all the evidence and all the things that Jesus was doing was kind of already spreading throughout the countryside, throughout all the people. That's why on Palm Sunday, all these people who had never seen him, people who didn't know him directly, were still putting down those palm branches and screaming and yelling, Hosanna, Hosanna. I mean, think about it. All of us, when we go to a sporting event or to a concert, I don't know, I haven't really been to any concerts recently, or someone that you really like, some famous person, we go there and we go crazy, right? I mean, it's part of the whole the crowd thing. Why do we do that? Because what we know about them. But you've never met them one-on-one. You've never talked with them. You don't have a relationship, per se, with them. But there's all this body of evidence that points to they're a nice person, they're a good person, or they're very entertaining, or they're very gifted, or they're very talented, or whatever it is that attracts you to that personality. So that's what was going on with Jesus. His disciples were with him day by day, day in and day out. So Jesus says, what do people think about me? Who do they say to him? And so Jesus is giving them all the stuff and saying, okay, the reason why I want you to think about what others think about me is I want you to make sure that you're not stuck there. The problem is for a lot of Christians who have good theology, a good understanding of the Bible and what the Bible says, that Jesus died on the cross for us, and if we will confess our sins and just repent and confess with our mouths that Jesus is Lord, then we'll be saved. Okay, we kind of understand that. Maybe you've heard it. Maybe you don't fully grasp or it doesn't hit your heart, but you've heard it enough times. Maybe it's by grace. It's not by anything that we do, but Jesus chooses to give that to us as a gift. Okay, all of that, but the problem is, if you don't have a relationship with Him, then you go like, okay, and then when difficulties come, you start to doubt, am I saved? Am I not saved? Is this really right? And so what's going on with the majority of the crowd is that they're saying, he's a prophet like in the Old Testament. He's this godly man. And here's the thing, I want to debunk a couple of things, not logically or with all this evidence, but I want you just to think through in your own mind, especially if you're a Christian, if you sometimes have doubts about who Jesus is. I think the first thing that we have a problem with is this, is that we have been burnt so much that we have an issue with trust. Maybe you've heard this and you've gone to church since you're a little kid, and so you kind of believe it, but then over the years you realize, well, do I want to have this blind faith? No, and I don't expect you to. But maybe you heard some things, or maybe you trusted certain people in your life that you respected, and they let you down, or something happened, and as a result, you're kind of a little bit scared to give all over, to pour out everything. But the point that I want to make to you is that that's totally understandable, and that's logical, and I don't think that's wrong. But one thing that you have to understand is there's a difference between testing things out and a little bit of incredulity and just being a lot more reasonable and cautious and being unwilling to make that leap and that risk when the evidence is great enough. The difference between someone who has a good relationship with someone is that at some point you have to take a risk and you have to overcome your fears of being hurt or of being misled, and you have to jump. It's true in our relationships with people. It's true, especially true in our relationship with someone we might want to marry, and it's definitely true in our relationship with Jesus. The problem is a lot of us haven't jumped. Now, I remember reading this a long time ago in this book by a professor of apologetics who argued for the Christian faith, and he says, incredulity is okay as long as you're willing to take the risk afterwards. And he gave this story about a famous artist named Dor who lived a couple centuries back. And he was traveling around Europe getting inspiration, sketching and stuff like that. And back then you needed papers to go from country to country. They were just sealed. And as he was traveling around, he realized he had lost his papers when he was trying to get back home. And so everybody there, he was pretty famous. Unlike a lot of artists who can become famous after they die. And so he was at the checkpoint and the guards were looking at him. And he said, I'm so-and-so, I'm Paul Dor, and you guys know me. I know you guys don't know who he is, but I remember reading this story. And one of the guys who was an art buff said, you do look like him. But back then they didn't have computers. They didn't have, passport and photo ID. They can't scan your fingerprint. They didn't do any of that. So he said, but without the papers, I can't let you in. How do I know? You're coming back from a country that we're not on friendly terms with. And he said, well, what can I do to prove? And then this guy came over and he said, okay, maybe go get some paper and pencils. And he said, sketch this guy, sketch that lady. So instantly he just started sketching. And then after a while, this guy finally was like, okay, this is amazing. I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to believe it. You look like him. You're incredibly gifted, artistic and stuff like that. But please come back later on with your, more definitive identifications. Okay, that's not going to happen at the TSA. You're not going to sit around and say, who I am, right? But I can imagine for some famous musicians, right, that everybody knows that they sang, they go, okay. But I still think with all the security, there's problems out there. But that's how it happened. If you have enough overwhelming evidence, at what point are you going to be willing to say, okay, you are who you say you are? And so for the disciples right now, this is a defining moment because Jesus has been saying who he is, the Son of God, that he's here to bring salvation. And then he's also been saying what's going to happen. And he's been doing miracles, and he's been teaching, and he's been just doing all these profound things. And the disciples are right there, and now it's the decision moment, the defining time that's going to come next. You know what? This is going to happen in our lives. On a regular basis, you're going to have to decide if Jesus, I believe Jesus to be who he says he is. There's going to be times in your life, junction points, when you have to make a decision. To step out, to take a risk, to decide for something else rather than what the world says you should do. That is something that is real. Let me just give you one more thing about why sometimes we're so unwilling to change. It's really hard, but it's this, I don't know, this whole thing about political correctness. It's a very scary thing. This whole thing about peer pressure or not, of fitting in or not going against the flow. Someone's busting here somewhere. I haven't heard that somewhere. A number of years ago, there was this political pundit who was talking about how people are so entrenched in their political parties that they just, without even thinking about it, they just throw the party on. Okay. Just getting away from all that. And he came, I don't know if he came up with it, but maybe reading in psychology or whatever. He presented this famous 5 monkeys story. Have any of you guys heard that about the psychology of 5 monkeys and the banana? Okay, just a couple of you. But I really think it's really important for us as Christians too. So there's 5 monkeys in this cage together, and they put up like this ladder or steps or whatever. I don't know exactly what it looked like, with a banana at the top. So they got hungry. So one of the banana, one of the monkeys, whoever, I don't know, the most aggressive one, the leader, would go up and try to get the bananas. And went up to get the banana. Around the cages, they were all positioned. But as soon as that monkey started going up the steps, one of the monkeys started, ice cold water was sprayed on all the other 4 monkeys that didn't go up, to train them not to go up. And so in the beginning, I guess a few times the banana was taken down, but every time they put a new banana in, the one monkey went up and sprayed the other monkeys with ice cold water. And after a short while of doing this, anytime there was a banana and the monkeys tried to go up, the other 4 monkeys would pull them down and beat on them. I don't want to get ice cold water sprayed on me. So after a while of reinforcing this behavior, and nobody got the banana anymore, they took one of the monkeys out, and they put a new monkey in that knew nothing about the ice cold water, just saw the banana. So what does this monkey do? What are you guys all doing? Just standing there, banana. And he starts walking up. And without any ice cold water being shot at the other monkeys, the other 4 monkeys yanked him down before he got to the banana and beat on him. You'd be like, what's wrong with you? They were so ingrained. And they took another monkey of the ones that got wet and took it out. So now there's 3 monkeys that used to get wet. Now there's 2 new monkeys that never knew about the water. So this monkey now the first monkey had been pulled down so much he doesn't even try to go and get the banana. So now the new monkey comes in, he's like, well, all you idiots doing is a banana. So he goes up, and then they pull him down, and they beat on him. And what they saw is that the first new monkey beat on it with the most joy and the most vigor. Because it's like, not knowing why, but that's what was going on. And eventually all 5 monkeys got trained over a course of a period of time. So that none of the monkeys ever got wet, and none of the monkeys ever ate the banana. But anytime any monkey got the idea, like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to get the banana, they would get pulled down. They don't know why they're pulling each other down. They don't know why they can't go get the banana, but they refuse to let one another go get the banana. That sounds funny. That sounds humorous. Dumb monkeys. But you know what? I think this is so true about our faith sometimes. We've been so beat down by the world in so many ways. Little ways, but it's been so continuously happening. You know what happens? We just buy into whatever everybody else is saying because we don't want to stick out. Because if you stick out, what happens? You get beat down. Verbally, emotionally. I think that's so phenomenal. And what Jesus wants us to know is this. if you know who I am, then you'll know who you are. And when the world comes and beats you down, you're going to remember the world beat me down. But what happens at the end? What happens next Sunday? What happens on Easter? I still rise up. They cannot keep you down. And the thing that I want you to think about a little bit is this. Who is Jesus to you? Not what the world says, but who is he to you? If you, like Peter, say, at least with your words, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, you're my Savior, you're my Lord, then the question that I'll now ask is, do you actually live that out? The thing is, Peter and all the disciples, they run away at a difficult time. And it's a sad case, but the amazing thing is that Jesus doesn't abandon them. He says, am I truly someone you love? As he reinstates Peter in John 21. He says, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than the world? Do you love me more than everybody else and their opinions? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And I think Jesus is saying, well, you know, your actions. He doesn't say that, but then do what I would want you to do. Do what is right. And there's going to come times in your careers, in your marriages, and whatever, where the world tells you to do one thing, and to be quiet, and to sit back, and to blend in. But where Jesus said, nope, it's not the way to do. And at that moment, when you step out, that's when you define your relationship with Jesus. Let me give you one relational advice that works with Jesus, but that also works. It just will make analogy and sense. If you're in a relationship with someone, loyalty and having their back is so critical. If someone feels like they can't trust you to have their back, eventually there's going to be mistrust and the relationship will be destroyed. And this is why in raising children, in a relationship with a husband or wife or a friend, doing what you say and saying what you will do is critical. Some of us need to be a lot more quiet and promise a lot less things. And some of us need to follow through better on the things that we say and say it more clearly. And this is why Jesus attacks us in our way of living. And he says, let your yes be yes. In other words, do what you say you're going to do, and your no be no. Say no to things if you're not sure you're going to be able to do it. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. What is he saying? It's not Satan talking through you. What he's saying is Satan came to destroy and break down relationships. And what happens is through mistrust. And the thing is, if you say, Lord, I'm still having a struggle with this, then okay, then don't act like you're not struggling with it and try to commit to doing more than that. Do what you can. Keep your word. Do that with your loved ones. Do that with your children. Being consistent and trustworthy is what's going to be that which builds up relationships. And the depth of your relationship with Jesus Christ is going to be exactly that. Say, Lord, I believe in you, so I'm going to do what you want. And if we do this, if we reflect upon this week, it doesn't have to be substantial, crazy things, but just step by step by step by step, Jesus will encourage you. He'll give you all the strength that you need. And we'll find great hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because he says this, he says, greater is he who is in you than he who is in you. He says, I have overcome the world. You can overcome it too. When we come to that place, there's an amazing freedom and peace that comes into our lives. So this week, may it be true that all of us will respond to Jesus' defining him in this question, who do you say that I am? He said, Lord, you are my Lord, my Savior, my God. Let's pray to you.